Let's take a look at race terminology. As a general rule, it's courteous to use the label preferred by members of another group. Surveys of US blacks have generally found a clear preference for black versus African American. However, not all US blacks identify as African American. Colloquial euphemisms date to slavery days and are now considered derogatory and insulting racial slurs when used by non blacks, but have a different connotation when used by blacks. Since 1980, Gallup polls have asked about Hispanic and Latino. Currently, 70% of respondents from this group express no preference, with others generally preferring Hispanic. Native American or American Indian are appropriate terms today, but tribal affiliation is also useful if known. In Canada, the term First Nations people is used. People of color refers collectively to blacks, Latinos, Native Americans, Asian Americans, and others. Racial distinctions are so ingrained in our culture that it's difficult not to notice them. Law and fairness imply that decisions in work environments should be made without attention to race, as if it didn't exist. Yet to determine whether race has made a difference, we must attend to it. This paradox underlines recent research on the consequences of a colorblind ideology versus a multicultural view that explicitly recognizes and values racial-ethnic differences. When someone actively tries to avoid mentioning race or acknowledging relevant racial differences, communication with a person of color is less effective and, in fact, may seem more prejudiced. Diversity professionals should identify potentially discriminatory organizational processes. Access discrimination occurs in recruiting, hiring, and placement and limits incorporation of underrepresented group members. After hiring, treatment discrimination occurs through such things as ineffective or inaccurate feedback, limited training or mentoring opportunities, or lower rates of promotions or raises. Advocacy for diversity and inclusion means bringing qualified, underrepresented people into the organization, and also making systems operate as well for them as those systems do for others. We cannot say how often such destructive processes actually occur in a typical work organization. They can be very subtle and not easily detected. Managers should be alert to these sources of bias and try to prevent and correct them. Employers should use fair selection processes and be able to defend against charges of discrimination. Best practice is to use valid predictors. However, persistent evidence of race differences on many of these measures makes them potentially discriminatory. Research on race differences in job attitudes is largely conducted in large-scale employment settings where large number of applicants are measured and carefully developed selection tools and assessment are used. Many smaller organizations, unlikely to be challenged legally, do not use rigorously developed selection processes and rely on brief, unstructured interviews, drug and background tests, or personal references. A test should be reliable or consistent. Does it give the same results every time, if circumstances haven't changed? A test should also be valid. It should measure what it claims to measure and very little else. Determining validity is a complex and challenging task and usually requires much data collection. In an employment context, cognitive ability and other tests should be used because of evidence they're correlated with measures of job performance. Measures of job performance are themselves not perfectly reliable or valid. Most studies on racial differences in selection compare samples of blacks and whites. Because meta-analysis requires a large number of studies, fewer overall comparisons involve other racial-ethnic groups. Racial-ethnic differences in selection tend to be higher than differences in actual job performance for those who were hired. Typical hiring plans often eliminate people of color who, if hired, would likely succeed. Nothing in these studies tells us why these differences are found. In the context of employee selection, illegal discrimination is suggested by a significant difference, adverse impact, in scores between whites and people of color. Therefore, employers often experience conflicts among validity, fairness, and support for diversity. In legal context, race discrimination is differential treatment based on race or ethnicity. Race discrimination includes unfair denials of employment or promotion, segregation of job assignments, lower pay, or exclusion from information or developmental opportunities such as mentoring or training. Racism is a negative, explicit, or implicit attitude based on racial ethnicity. From this perspective, members of any racial group can be racist. The term institutional racism denotes a system or structure of assumptions, procedures, norms, and regulations that disadvantages a group based on color, race, or ethnicity. Though racial disadvantage is embedded in institutions of the organization, individuals holding racist attitudes would have difficulty maintaining those attitudes without support from the culture and social environment. If an employee holds racist attitudes towards others that are expressed in hurtful speech or harmful behavior, the appropriate response is to deal with this as an unacceptable workplace behavior. However, racism can be embedded in an organization's culture even though individuals profess no prejudicial attitudes. In this situation, the diversity professional should work to change the systems that may lead to discriminatory results. Contemporary racism is usually more subtle than earlier blatant racial prejudice that still exists but is now generally considered unacceptable, at least openly. Even people who do not fully agree with this change usually try to act in ways that others will think are non-prejudiced. They will be reluctant to be seen as racist and believe that others would disapprove of clearly discriminatory behavior. A different form of prejudice is called implicit bias, a non-conscious or unconscious and automatic response based on previous experience and implying favorable or unfavorable emotional, cognitive, or behavioral reactions. The implicit attitude is activated automatically and changes very slowly. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or nationality. The Immigration Control and Reform Act is not generally considered an anti-discrimination statute because its main purpose concerns employment of immigrants. However, the IRCA also prohibits discrimination on the basis of national origin, so that an employer cannot simply decide not to hire Latinos as an example. Under Title VII, discrimination can be obvious or it can be difficult to recognize when embedded in a seemingly normal system. Race discrimination may take the form of racial or ethnic harassment, which can be disparate treatment. Race harassment refers to the creation of an environment imbued with slurs, graffiti, threats, incivility, or exclusionary behavior based on racial ethnicity. It's associated with reduced organizational commitment and job satisfaction, as well as increased anxiety and depression, physical symptoms, and the intention to leave, and is more often targeted at people of color than whites. Reverse discrimination refers to a situation in which the majority is harmed by a procedure that puts in place to prevent or correct unfair consequences to members of a traditionally underrepresented group, usually people of color or women. The term is misleading because it implies that discrimination can occur only to members of oppressed groups when in fact it can occur to any protected group. In addition, the term suggests a sense of entitlement on the part of the privileged group.